The winter of 1886 came early to the Dakota Territory. By the second week of October, the prairie grass had already turned the color of old bone, and the wind off the northern plains carried a bite that made grown men wince and turn their collars up. The sky sat low and gray, heavy as a wool blanket soaked through with cold water, pressing down on the flat earth like it meant to smother everything beneath it. It was into this world that Nora Callahan walked alone. She was 16 years old. She carried everything she owned in a canvas sack worn thin at the bottom seam. Inside, one wool blanket, a knife, a spoon, a small tin pot, 2 plates, a kerosene lantern with the reservoir less than half full, and 3 books her mother had pressed into her hands the winter before she died. Beside her walked her brother Emmett, 9 years old, his boots 2 sizes too large, his coat missing the top button. He had run after her when their stepfather Warren threw open the front door and hurled her sack into the yard. Emmett had not been told to leave. He had simply refused to stay. Warren had stood on the porch and watched them go. He did not call Emmett back. His last words followed them down the frozen road like something thrown. A useless girl dragging a useless boy into the dirt. The prairie will finish what I started. Nora did not look back. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the thin gray line where the earth met the sky, and she walked. She had exactly $200. It was her mother's money, saved coin by coin through 3 years of domestic work in a Chicago parlor house, laundering other people's linens and scrubbing other people's floors. Her mother had sewn the bills into the lining of Nora's winter coat the autumn before she passed, and she had pressed a small folded piece of paper into Nora's palm along with it. The paper had been worn soft at the creases from years of folding and unfolding. The handwriting was her grandfather's, Seamus Callahan, dead 11 years by then, a man who had come from County Clare in Ireland when he was 22 and had spent the rest of his life trying to understand the American earth. The note said 4 things. Find Willow Creek. Dig 6 feet. The ground will keep you. And below that, in smaller letters, as if added as an afterthought, the earth always remembers. Nora had read those words so many times she could have recited them in her sleep. She did not fully understand them yet, but she held on to them the way you hold on to a railing in the dark, not because you can see where it leads, but because it is the only solid thing your hand can find. They boarded a westbound train at dawn and rode it for 2 days. When they stepped off the supply wagon in Millhaven, Dakota Territory, the town regarded them with the particular expression of a place that has seen too many people arrive with hope and leave with nothing. Millhaven was 31 buildings strung along a single dirt road. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, and enough mud between the structures to swallow a boot hole. The population hovered somewhere around 90 souls, depending on the season and the weather and how many men had given up and gone back east. Prescott Aldridge was the first to speak to her. He was the wealthiest homesteader in the territory, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a permanent expression of someone who has never once been told no. He rode a good horse and wore a coat that had been made for him specifically. He looked Nora up and down the way a man appraises livestock, not cruelly, exactly, but without any particular warmth either. He told her he could offer her work, $3 a month, plus room and board in the storage room behind his house. He added that it was a better fate than ending up frozen in a ditch, which he seemed to consider a generous observation. Captain Albert Voss stood nearby, arms crossed. He had read 4 books on frontier survival and considered this sufficient expertise. He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a barn that has been built on a floodplain. He said nothing directly to Nora. He said it to Aldridge instead, as though Nora were not standing 3 feet away. "She won't last the month," he said. "You're wasting a good offer." Reverend Ormond Hale approached last. He was a narrow man with a wide voice, the kind of preacher who had never quite managed to separate godliness from self-satisfaction. He told Nora that the Lord provided for those who sought proper shelter and proper guidance, and that a young woman alone on the frontier would do well to pray for a swift and suitable marriage. He said it kindly enough. That almost made it worse. Nora looked at each of them in turn. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply stood there in the mud and the wind with her canvas sack and her half-empty lantern and her $200, and she let them finish. Then Emmett tugged at her sleeve. "Where will we sleep, Nora?" She pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket. She read it one more time, though she did not need to. She looked out past the edge of town to where Willow Creek bent north through a stand of bare cottonwoods, their branches scratching at the pale sky. "We're going to dig," she said. She said it quietly, not to Emmett particularly, not to Aldridge or Voss or Reverend Hale. She said it the way you say something when you are saying it first to yourself. When you are making a promise you intend to keep, even though you cannot yet see the shape of what keeping it will cost you. The men looked at each other. Aldridge made a sound in the back of his throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something between pity and contempt. "Suit yourself," he said, and turned his horse back toward his 2-story house with its glass windows and its Chicago-made stove and its $800 worth of milled lumber. He did not look back either. What none of them knew, what Nora herself did not yet know, was that the land she was walking toward had a history she had not been told. That somewhere beneath the frost-hardened soil beside Willow Creek, under the roots of the prairie grass and the cold, dark weight of 18 years of seasons, there was a tin box buried beneath a hearthstone. And that tin box had not been placed there by a stranger. The person who had buried it had stood on that same frozen ground before Nora was born, had pressed their hands into that same cold clay, had looked out at the same low gray sky and made the same decision. Not because it was easy, but because there was no other choice left. Nora did not know this yet. She would not know it until the storm came, but the earth knew. The earth had been keeping that secret for 18 years, patient and still and cold, waiting for the right pair of hands to come along and find it. The earth always remembers. Emmett fell into step beside her, his 2 large boots crunching through the frost. Scout, though she did not know Scout yet, did not know the old gray dog who would find them 3 days from now, thin-ribbed and abandoned beside the creek, who would sit down in front of their half-dug hole and refuse to leave. Scout was still somewhere, out in the tall dead grass, waiting. Everything was still waiting. But Nora Callahan was already walking toward it. The wind came off the North Plains and hit her full in the face, cold enough to make her eyes water, cold enough to sting the skin raw. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. 16 years old. $200. A worn piece of paper with 4 lines of her grandfather's handwriting, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that the ground beneath her feet already knew her name. The first morning, Nora dug with a sharpened branch. She had no proper shovel. She had spent the last of her tool budget on a hand axe and a coil of rope, and she stood at the edge of the spot where the creek bent north and drove the pointed end of a cottonwood branch into the ground and began to work. The Dakota topsoil was dense and matted, bound together by decades of prairie root, and the branch skidded off the surface more often than it bit in. Her palms blistered within the first hour. By mid-morning, the blisters had broken. Emmett worked beside her, prying loose stones from the creek bed and hauling them up the bank in the front of his coat. He did not complain. He was 9 years old, and he understood, with the particular clarity of children who have grown up in difficult houses, that complaining would not make the ground softer or the wind quieter or the afternoon come any faster. So he worked. He brought stones. He stacked them in a neat pile the way Nora showed him, sorted by size, the flattest ones set apart for the floor. By the time the sun began to drop behind the flat horizon, they had cleared perhaps 8 inches of depth across the footprint Nora had scored into the earth. A rectangle roughly 10 feet wide and 16 feet long. Her back screamed. Her hands were raw to the knuckle. She sat on the rim of the shallow depression and looked at what she had accomplished, and felt something very close to despair pass through her, quick and cold, like a draft under a door. She pushed it back down. She read the note again. Dig 6 feet. The ground will keep you. 6 feet. She had managed 8 inches in a full day of work. She did the arithmetic in her head, estimated the days remaining before the first hard frost, and decided not to finish the calculation. They slept on the open ground that night, wrapped in the single wool blanket, Emmett curled against her side for warmth. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. Nora lay awake most of the night, listening to the wind move through the dead grass and staring up at a sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had punched holes through a piece of black cloth and put a light behind it. She thought about her grandfather. Seamus Callahan had come to America with nothing. Less than nothing, her mother had said, because when you come from a country that has been systematically emptied of everything that once belonged to the people living in it, nothing is not where you start. You start in debt to your own history. He had worked the mines in Pennsylvania for 6 years, learned the way stone and earth behave under pressure, learned how to read the composition of soil the way other men read weather, and then he had come west when the Homestead Act opened up the Dakota Territory, and he had claimed a parcel of land beside a creek that bent north. And then he had disappeared. Her mother had never said exactly what happened, only that Seamus left and did not come back, and that he had been the kind of man who knew things that other men didn't, and that some of what he knew he had written down and made her promise to keep safe. The note had been in the family for 18 years. Nora turned onto her side and tucked her knees to her chest and closed her eyes. She was 16 years old. Her hands were bleeding through the rags she had wrapped them in. She was sleeping on frozen ground in a territory that had already killed men twice her age and 3 times her size. She thought, he built this for you. She did not know yet what that meant, but she held on to it. On the second day, a shadow fell across the rim of her pit. She looked up. A man stood there, lean and fair-haired, perhaps 30 years old, with the particular quietness of someone who has learned not to announce himself. He was Norwegian, she would learn later. Eric Strand, a carpenter who had come west the previous spring with a box of good tools and a reasonable command of English and not much else. He looked at the pit. He looked at Nora. He looked at her sharpened branch. He set down a proper iron-bladed shovel without a word, turned and walked back toward town. Nora stared at the shovel for a long moment. Emmett said, "Should we use it?" "Yes," Nora said. She did not know what to make of the gesture. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was too busy surviving to examine things carefully, and she picked up the shovel and went back to work. The shovel changed everything. By the end of the second day, she had hit 3 feet. The soil below the root mat was darker and more cooperative, damp and yielding, and she began to understand what her grandfather had written about. The way the earth changes character as you go deeper, the way the temperature stays steadier, the way the wind that tears everything apart at the surface has no power whatsoever 6 feet down. She could feel it even now, the faint difference in the air at the bottom of the pit, a degree or two warmer, still and quiet as a held breath. It felt, she thought, like the earth was making room for her. On the third morning, Prescott Aldridge rode past on his good horse. He stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down at her. He had brought his oldest son with him, a boy of about 14 who had his father's eyes and his father's habit of looking at things with an air of conclusion already reached. "Still at it," Aldridge said. It was not a question. Nora kept digging. "You've got till the end of the month before the hard freeze sets in," he said. "Even if you finish the hole, which I doubt, you'll never get a roof on it in time." Nora stopped. She looked up at him. The sun was behind him, and she had to shield her eyes with her forearm, which meant she was squinting when she answered him, which probably made her look less serious than she intended. "Then I'd better not stop to talk," she said. Aldridge made the sound again, that particular sound between pity and contempt, and rode on. His son looked back twice over his shoulder before they turned the bend. Captain Elbert Voss came that same afternoon. He stood at a distance, not at the rim, but about 10 feet back, as though he didn't want to get too close in case failure was contagious. He had his survival manual under his arm. He read aloud from it for a moment. Something about proper foundation requirements and drainage considerations, and then he told Nora that she was going to have a water problem when the spring thaw came. "You're building a bathtub," he said, "not a home." Nora thought about the creek bend. She thought about the angle of the land and the direction the water would drain in spring. She said nothing because she had already accounted for the drainage, had chosen this specific location because the slight natural slope away from the creek meant the water table would not reach her floor depth. But she saw no particular advantage in explaining this to Voss. "I appreciate the concern," she said, and went back to work. Voss stood there a moment longer, then left. It was Harriet Webb who came on the fourth morning. Harriet was a widow in her 60s who lived at the edge of town, in a house that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite recovered from the experience. She was small and angular, with white hair pulled back so tight it seemed to hold the rest of her face in place. And she had the manner of someone who had outlived a great many people's expectations of her and had no plans to stop. She walked up to the edge of the pit, looked down at Nora for a long time without speaking, and then set a canvas bag on the ground. "Flour," she said, "salt pork, dried beans." Nora looked at the bag. She looked at Harriet. "I don't give this to fools," Harriet said, "so don't make me regret it." She turned and walked back toward town without waiting for a response. Emmett watched her go. "Do you think she likes us?" "I think she's watching," Nora said. That evening, Reverend Ormond Hale made his pastoral visit. He stood at the rim of the pit with his hands clasped behind his back and looked down with the expression of a man presiding over something he considers inevitable. He told Nora that the Lord built reaching toward heaven, not burrowing into the earth, and that the scripture was clear on the matter of pride, which he seemed to feel was relevant to her situation. Nora drove the shovel into the clay and met his eyes. "My grandfather said the earth protects its children," she said. "I trust his word." "Your grandfather," the Reverend said carefully, "is not scripture." "No," Nora agreed. He knew this particular ground. The Reverend walked away, muttering. Nora went back to digging. She hit 4 feet by sundown. On the 4th night, Emmett got sick. It came on fast, the way illness comes on in the cold. Not gradually, but all at once, like something that had been waiting for the right moment of weakness. He was fine at supper, quiet but fine, eating his share of the beans Harriet had brought. Then, within the hour, he was shivering so hard Nora could hear his teeth knock together, and when she pressed her palm to his forehead, she felt the heat radiating off him like a small stove. She had 3 matches left. The pit was 4 feet deep and still open to the sky. Not yet a shelter, but a hole in the ground, and the temperature was dropping toward single digits. She had no medicine. She had no doctor. The nearest one was 11 miles away in the next township, and even if she had had the money to pay him, she had no way to cover 11 miles in the dark in a Dakota winter. She sat back on her heels and looked at Emmett, and felt something move through her that was not panic, exactly, because panic would have meant losing the thread, and she could not afford to lose the thread. It was more like the moment before panic, the still white second when you understand exactly how serious a thing is before your body decides how to respond. She thought of the note. She unfolded it in the dark, though she could not read it. She had it memorized. She went through it word by word, looking for something she might have missed, and then she turned it over. She had turned it over before, many times. And there it was, in smaller handwriting, cramped as if added quickly, in a different ink. Willow bark. Boil it thin. Fever down by morning. She had read those words before, without understanding them as instruction. Now she understood. She took the knife. She went to the creek in the dark, moving carefully across the frozen ground, and she cut strips of bark from the willow trees that crowded the bank. Not the outer bark, but the inner bark, the pale layer beneath, soft and damp even in the cold. Her hands had no feeling in them by the time she had enough. She came back to the pit, built a small fire from the driest kindling she had been hoarding for 3 days, and she used one of her 3 matches. The flame caught. She boiled the bark in the tin pot with creek water, stripped down to a thin tea, and she held Emmett's head up and got him to drink it in small sips, a little at a time, through most of the night. He did not fully wake up. He was somewhere between sleep and fever, saying words she couldn't parse, sometimes calling for their mother. Nora sat beside him, with her back against the cold clay wall and her knees pulled to her chest, and she held his hand, and she did not sleep. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, the shivering slowed. By first light, his forehead was cooler. By the time the sun came fully up over the flat horizon, Emmett opened his eyes and said he was hungry. Nora pressed her face into her knees and breathed. Just breathed. One long breath in and one long breath out. Steady and deliberate. The way you breathe when you are making sure you still can. Then she got up and lit the fire again and made him the last of the oats. She still had 2 matches left. She went back to digging. She hit 5 feet on the 6th day and 6 feet on the 8th, and the difference between the two was more than the 2 inches of soil it represented. At 6 feet, the earth was a different country entirely. The temperature at the base of the pit hovered between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above was doing. The walls were dark and dense, packed clay that held its shape cleanly when she smoothed it with her palms. The sound of the wind, which had been her constant companion since the moment she arrived in Millhaven, disappeared almost entirely. She could hear her own heartbeat. She stood at the bottom of the pit and looked up at the rectangle of pale Dakota sky above her and felt, for the first time since Warren had thrown her sack onto the frozen yard, something that was not fear or determination or calculation, but something simpler and older and more fundamental. She felt safe. Scout found them on the 9th day. He simply appeared at the edge of the pit one morning. An old dog, gray around the muzzle, with ribs that showed through his coat, and one ear that had been torn at some point and healed crooked. He sat down at the rim and looked at Nora with the patient, unsentimental eyes of an animal that has given up expecting much from the world, but has not quite given up entirely. Emmett saw him first. Nora. She looked up from the floor stones she was laying. The dog looked back at her without moving. "He's hungry," Emmett said. "So are we," Nora said. "Can we keep him?" "No," Nora said. "We can barely feed ourselves." She went back to work. That evening, she gave the dog a piece of the salt pork. She told herself it was because a dog could serve as an early warning system, a practical consideration, not sentiment. Emmett did not say anything. He just sat beside Scout and ran his hand along the dog's flank, feeling each rib individually, and Scout leaned into him with the absolute trust of the completely exhausted. Nora watched them from the corner of her eye. "1 week," she said. "If he slows us down, he goes." Scout did not slow them down. He patrolled the perimeter of the site in the early mornings, pacing the ridgeline with his nose low, growling once in a while at nothing Nora could see. At night, he slept curled against Emmett's back, and the body heat he provided was not nothing. Was, in fact, immeasurable comfort on the nights when the temperature dropped below 0, and the wool blanket did not feel like nearly enough. He did not go. The roof was the hardest part. She had no mill lumber. She had no money left for mill lumber. She hiked the creek bank for 3 days, selecting fallen cottonwoods, the straightest ones, roughly 4 inches across, and she lashed a rope around her waist and dragged them one at a time up the slope to the site. Each log weighed more than she expected. She had to stop every 30 feet to rest, hands on her knees, lungs burning, and she was aware on each of these stops of the particular quality of silence that meant someone was watching from a distance. She did not look up. She laid the beams across the width of the pit, 12 inches apart, and then she cut sod blocks from the prairie surface, dense bricks of topsoil held together by living grass roots, 12 inches wide, 2 feet long, 3 inches thick, heavier than they looked, heavier than they had any right to be. She stacked them on top of the cottonwood beams, 3 layers deep. 10 inches of living prairie earth over her head. Soil that could breathe. Soil that remembered summer in the middle of January. Emmett found a piece of broken slate on the 7th day and carried it back to the site with both hands, carefully, the way you carry something you plan to use for a long time. He set it beside the wall. "For my lessons," he said. Nora looked at him. He was 9 years old, standing in a half-finished hole in the ground in the middle of a Dakota winter, and he was thinking about his education. She had to turn away before he could see her face. She built the front wall from standing cottonwood logs, 4 inches across and 8 feet tall, driven upright into the ground, side by side. The gaps packed with dried prairie grass and sealed with a mortar she made from riverbed clay and water and more grass, worked together with her bare hands into a mixture that dried harder than she expected in the autumn sun. She found weathered planks from an abandoned wagon bed half buried in the grass half a mile east and dragged them back to make the door, crooked on its hinges, not beautiful, but solid. And when she pulled it shut, the wind stopped. Just stopped. She stood inside for a moment in the silence. The hearth was river stones, smooth, fist-sized, heavily polished by the current, and therefore resistant to cracking under here. She stacked them in the far corner, a small chamber for burning, and she made the flue from kerosene cans hammered flat and joined with wet clay, a pipe that ran up through the sod roof and vented cleanly into the open air. The whole structure had cost her $29 in tools and materials. She was 6 weeks from the day she had arrived in Millhaven. She was 16 years old. She had $2 left. On the first evening, she lit a fire. She used the last match. The flame was small, nothing dramatic, nothing that would impress anyone. A modest bundle of dry twigs, none thicker than her thumb, burning in the stone hearth. But the warmth that moved through the room in the following minutes was unlike anything she had felt in a very long time. It did not come from the air, the way warmth from an iron stove comes through the air, hitting you on one side and leaving the other cold. It came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the 6 feet of compressed Dakota clay surrounding her on 3 sides and above. The stones absorbed the heat, the earth absorbed the heat, and then the earth held it. She had seen it work in theory, in her grandfather's descriptions, in the logic of the thing as she understood it. But understanding something in theory is a different thing entirely from sitting in the bottom of it at 55 degrees, while the wind outside drops the temperature to 6 below zero. Emmett fell asleep against Scout's side. Nora sat with her knees to her chest and her back against the warm clay wall, and she listened to the wind above ground trying to find a way in and not finding one. She thought about her grandfather, about the note, about the 4 lines of his handwriting that had brought her here. She thought about the tin box. She did not know yet that there was a tin box. That was still coming. That was waiting under the hearthstone with 18 years of patience, waiting for the right set of hands and the right moment and the storm that would make the finding of it matter. But she felt something, some faint quality in the silence of the room that was not merely absence of noise, but presence of something. Continuity, perhaps. History. The sense that these walls had memory. The earth always remembers. It was during this first week in the completed shelter that the trouble found its formal shape. Deputy Silas Crane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a county horse and carrying a folded document that he held out to Nora with the expression of a man who has been asked to do something distasteful but intends to do it thoroughly. The document was a complaint filed by Prescott Aldridge. It cited unsafe structural conditions, unsanitary living arrangements, and, this was the part that made Nora's hands go cold, inadequate guardianship. Aldridge had submitted a sworn statement that Emmett was being raised in conditions unfit for a child. Nora was 16, not yet of legal majority. She was Emmett's half-sister, not a parent, not a blood relation on his father's side. Warren, as the legal stepfather, retained custodial claim. If Nora did not vacate the property within 15 days, Emmett would be remanded to the Millhaven County Orphanage pending a proper custodial hearing. Nora read the document twice. She asked Crane how much a lawyer cost. He told her. She had $2. After Crane left, she stood for a long time in the doorway looking out at the flat, gray afternoon. The cottonwoods had lost the last of their leaves. The creek was beginning to skin over at the edges. Across the flat ground, she could see the roofline of Aldridge's two-story house, the chimney smoke rising straight up in the still air, the glass windows catching the low afternoon light. She thought, he wants the creek land. He wants to build his mill, and he needs the water rights, and the only thing standing between him and those water rights is a 16-year-old girl and a piece of paper from a homesteader who disappeared 18 years ago. She also thought something else, something harder to think, because it required her to consider a possibility she had been keeping at a careful distance from herself since the day she arrived. She thought, maybe Emmett would be warmer somewhere else. Maybe a warm room with a proper bed and a proper stove and food that wasn't rationed down to the last spoonful was worth more than a half-finished dugout with a girl for a guardian who had $2 to her name and 15 days before the county came for him. Maybe keeping him here was not protection. Maybe it was selfishness. She sat with this for a long time. That night, she sat awake long after Emmett had fallen asleep. Scout was at the foot of Emmett's bedroll, one eye half open, watching her. The fire had burned down to coals, and the stones were doing their slow work, radiating the stored warmth back into the room. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving over the sod roof like something heavy being dragged. Emmett turned in his sleep and said a word she couldn't hear, and then clearly, in his ordinary waking voice, as if addressing someone standing right beside him, "Mama." Just that. Nora put her face in her hands. She sat like that for a while. Then she raised her head and looked at the door and the sealed walls and the warm, dark room that she had made with a sharpened branch and her bare knuckles and $2 and her grandfather's handwriting. And she thought about Warren standing on the porch saying the prairie will finish what I started. And she thought about what finishing meant, not just freezing, not just the obvious physical things, but the other kind of finishing, the kind that tells a boy his life is not worth keeping, that the people who were supposed to hold on to him let go, that the ground beneath him will not hold. She was not going to let Warren finish it. She wiped her face. She lay down beside Emmett and pulled the blanket over both of them. Scout shifted and resettled, a warm weight against her back. In the morning, she went to find Harriet Webb. Harriet was hanging washing on a line strung between two fence posts in her yard, working with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been doing the same tasks for 40 years and has no patience for drama. She listened to Nora describe the document without changing expression. When Nora finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment, holding a pillowcase against her chest. "There's a lawyer in Hettinger," she said. "Older man, Ezra Flood. He handles land disputes mostly, but he's honest, which is rarer than useful out here." She paused. "He sometimes works on credit." "I have $2, Nora said. "Tell him that," Harriet said. "Tell him the whole thing. He'll either help or he won't, but he won't laugh at you." She handed the pillowcase to Nora and nodded at the line, and Nora helped her hang the rest of the washing, and neither of them said anything more about it, which was its own kind of answer. It was Harriet herself, 2 days later, who told Nora the thing that changed everything. She came to the dugout in the early evening, stepping carefully through the frost-stiff grass, and she stood inside the doorway, looking at the walls and the hearth and the sod ceiling with an expression that Nora could not immediately read. Something between recognition and sorrow, the look of someone encountering a thing they thought was lost. "There was a man," Harriet said, "years ago. Before my husband and I came here." She paused. "His name was Callahan, Irish. He claimed a parcel along the creek. This parcel, I believe, dug into the ground, same as you." She looked at Nora. "He left before the winter. Nobody knew why. The claim just sat." Nora was very still. "Seamus Callahan," she said. Harriet looked at her. "My grandfather," Nora said. The silence in the warm room was different after that. Fuller, somehow, like a room that has been empty for a long time and has just remembered what it is for. 3 days later, Nora rode to Hettinger on the back of a supply wagon and found Ezra Flood's office above the hardware store and laid out the entire story on his desk. The note, the homestead claim number she had found scrawled in the margin of the original paper, the name Seamus Callahan, and the year 1868. Flood listened without interrupting. Then he went to his files. He was in the files for a long time. When he came back, he sat down slowly, the way a man sits down when he has found something he did not expect to find. "The claim is still active," he said. "Seamus Callahan, 1868, never formally abandoned, never transferred." He set the file on the desk and looked at Nora over his glasses. "Which means, by direct family descent, it belongs to you." Nora looked at the file. "Aldridge knows," she said. "It was not a question. He's been trying to have it declared abandoned for 2 years," Flood said. "He came close. If you hadn't shown up when you did." He let the sentence finish itself. Nora thought about the note, about the words, "for the one who comes after me," about the possibility that her grandfather had not simply described a technique or a location, but had done something more deliberate, had staked a claim to a piece of ground and left the means of finding it for whoever in his family would one day need it badly enough to look. "But there's more," Flood said. He turned the file toward her. At the bottom of the survey notes, in the cramped handwriting of a man writing quickly, as if he did not have much time, were words she had not seen before. "For the one who comes after me, dig where the creek bends north, 6 feet. The ground remembers. Not just the claim, not just the land, the exact location, the exact depth." Her grandfather had not only chosen this land for his family, he had already chosen the spot. Nora rode back to Millhaven on the supply wagon as the sun went down behind the flat horizon, turning the sky the color of a bruise, orange and purple and deep cold gray. She held the copied survey notes in her coat pocket, folded against her chest. Scout met her at the edge of the site, tail moving in his slow old dog way, and Emmett was at the door with his piece of slate, working through figures by the fading light. He looked up. "Good news?" he said. "Maybe," Nora said. She paused. "Possibly very good." She looked at the dugout, at the sod roof and the crooked door, and the faint thread of smoke rising from the tin chimney. She thought of everything it had cost to build it. The blistered hands and the broken fingernails and the 8 days of digging and the night Emmett had a fever and she had 1 match left. She thought of her grandfather's hands. The same soil, the same creek, the same cold. The earth always remembers. What she did not know, what she could not yet know, was that somewhere out in the flat, dark prairie beyond the firelight, a man named Aldridge was reading his own copy of the survey documents, the ones Flood had not yet had time to lock away, and that Aldridge had a different plan for what happened next, and that 3 days after that, Eric Strand would disappear without a word, and that the note he would leave behind, tucked beneath a flat stone by the door, would say only, "Trust me, don't sign anything." E. But that was still coming. For now, Nora Callahan went inside and shut the door against the cold, and the dugout held the warmth exactly as her grandfather had said it would, and the ground remembered, and the night outside was very dark and very still and full of things that were waiting to begin. 3 days after Nora returned from Hettinger, Eric Strand was gone. Not gone in the way that people leave when they have made a decision and want you to know it. No packed wagon, no goodbye at the general store, no explanation passed through Harriet Webb or anyone else. Simply gone. His tools were still in the lean-to behind the livery where he rented space. His coat was gone. His horse was gone. And the space where he had been, the specific quality of his presence that Nora had not realized she had been counting on until it was absent, was gone too. She told herself it did not matter. She had built the dugout without him. She had found the survey documents without him. She had kept Emmett fed and warm and alive through the first weeks of a Dakota winter without him. She did not need Eric Strand to stay, and she would not waste time wondering why he hadn't. She told herself this several times over the following days, with decreasing conviction. On the 3rd morning after his disappearance, Emmett found the note. He almost didn't find it. He was collecting stones from the creek bank, the flat ones Nora used to shore up the drainage channel she had cut along the eastern wall, and he lifted a particular flat stone that was slightly out of place, set at an angle rather than lying flush, and beneath it was a small folded piece of paper, slightly damp at the edges from the morning frost. He brought it to Nora without opening it. She unfolded it. 5 words, in Eric's careful carpenter's handwriting. "Trust me. Don't sign anything." E. She read it twice. She turned it over. Nothing else. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket, next to the survey notes. Emmett watched her face. "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Do you trust him?" Nora looked out at the creek, at the ice that had begun to form along both banks, the current running dark and quick between the frozen edges. She thought about the shovel left without a word. She thought about the way he came by the site more often than there was any practical reason to, always at the edge of things, never quite inserting himself, never asking for anything back. "I don't know that either," she said. "Not yet." She put the note away and went back to work. That same afternoon, Prescott Aldridge rode past the site and did not stop. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the dugout, at the sod roof and the tin chimney and the carefully built front wall, with an expression she could not fully read from a distance. Not pity this time, not contempt, something more calculated, more patient, like a man who has revised his assessment of an obstacle and is now deciding on a different approach. She watched him ride on toward town. She thought, he knows about the survey. She thought, he is not finished. She was right on both counts. The next day, the sky changed. It happened in the early afternoon, when the light was already thin and low. The color shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a bruise develops under skin, the yellow-gray spreading from the northwest horizon inward, pressing down over the flat land like a hand pressing down on a drum. The temperature had been hovering around 20 degrees all morning. By 2 o'clock, it had dropped to 8. Scout felt it before anyone else. He had been sleeping most of the morning, which was his habit, curled against the east wall where the stored warmth from the stones pooled lowest and stayed longest. But sometime around noon, he stopped sleeping. He stood up. He walked to the door and back. He walked to the door again. He stood with his nose pressed to the gap at the bottom of the frame, not moving, not making any sound, just breathing in whatever the outside air was telling him. Emmett watched him. He's worried about something. He smells weather, Nora said. She went outside and stood on the ridge above the dugout and looked northwest. The sky in that direction had gone the color of old pewter, flat and lightless and very close. There were no clouds exactly, just a darkness in the atmosphere, a quality of pressure she could feel in the bones of her face, behind her eyes, in the particular way the air moved against her skin. She had never seen the winter of 1873. She had been 5 years old, living in Chicago, but Harriet Webb had described it to her once, briefly, without drama, the way people describe things that have left a mark too deep for embellishment. The sky went yellow in the afternoon, Harriet had said, and then by evening there was nothing left of the world but white. The sky was yellow now, not bright yellow, the yellow of old bone, the yellow of something that has been drained of color by a long, deep cold. Nora went to find Harriet Webb. She found her in her yard, standing perfectly still, looking at the same sky. "How bad?" Nora said. Harriet was quiet for a moment. "The winter of 73 looked exactly like this," she said. "We lost 11 people, 3 families. One of them was found in the spring, still at the table. They hadn't even had time to stand up." Nora looked at her. "Go warn them," Harriet said. "They won't listen, but go anyway, so that afterward there's no question about whether they knew." Nora went. She went first to Prescott Aldridge's house. She knocked at the front door, which was opened by his housekeeper, and she asked to speak with Aldridge directly. He came to the door in his shirt sleeves, already annoyed at the interruption, and she told him what she saw in the sky and what Harriet Webb had said about the winter of 1873. Aldridge looked past her at the sky. He looked back at her. "The almanac forecasts clear weather through the end of the month," he said. "The almanac was printed in Ohio," Nora said. He closed the door. She went to Captain Voss. He was in his barn, inspecting the cedar shakes on a section of roofing he was replacing, and he listened to her with the patient expression of a man who is waiting for someone to finish saying something incorrect before he explains why it is incorrect. "Animals don't predict weather," he said when she mentioned Scout. "They respond to stimuli we misinterpret as prediction. There's a chapter on this in 11 People, Nora said. 1873. Ask Harriet Webb. Harriet Webb is 70 years old and prone to catastrophizing, Voss said pleasantly. I appreciate the concern. She went to Reverend Hale's house, the old clapboard structure at the center of town, and she knocked, and he came to the door with his Bible already in hand, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of something important. She told him what she had seen. She told him about the sky. She told him about 1873. Only the Lord knows the hour, he said, which was the same thing he had said about marriage and about her dugout and about most things he did not wish to engage with directly. We will pray for fair weather. Praying and preparing are not the same thing, Nora said. No, the Reverend agreed. They are not. One requires faith. The other suggests a lack of it. He closed the door. She went to 4 more houses after that, the remaining homesteaders within a mile of town. 2 of them listened politely and then explained that they had proper houses with proper stoves and proper lumber walls and were not particularly concerned. One told her to go home. One was not there. On her way back through the main road, 3 young men were standing outside the general store, the same 3 who had taken to calling her the Mole Girl, who had a running wager among themselves about the date of her departure, which Aldridge's son had told her about in what he apparently considered friendly conversation. The tallest one cupped his hands around his mouth. "The Mole Girl's scared of sunshine," he called. The other 2 laughed. Nora looked at the sky once more. She looked at them. She did not say anything. She walked back to the dugout, and she spent the rest of the afternoon moving every piece of food, every tool, every essential item inside, and she filled the 2 largest pots and the cooking kettle with creek water and set them in the corner to keep from freezing, and she stacked every piece of dry wood and kindling along the inner wall until the stack was nearly as tall as she was. Emmett watched her work. "Is it coming tonight?" "I don't know when," she said, "but it's coming." "How bad?" She thought about 11 people, 3 families, found at the table in the spring. "Bad enough that we stay inside until it's over," she said, "no matter what." Scout stopped pacing at sundown. He lay down by the door and put his chin on his paws and watched the sealed frame with an expression of complete and absolute attention. The storm arrived 4 hours after dark. It did not arrive gradually. One moment the night was cold and still, the kind of stillness that precedes things. The next moment the world came apart. The wind hit the sod roof like something thrown, not a sustained pressure, but an impact, a physical strike, as if the atmosphere had made a fist. Nora felt it in the floor beneath her feet. The tin chimney shrieked. The packed clay walls groaned once, low and deep, like a ship taking a wave, and then settled, and then the real sound began. It was not howling. Howling suggests something animal, something with a shape and a direction. This was different. This was a sound that had no source and no boundary, a sound that existed everywhere at once, above and below and inside the skull, a tearing, rending, absolute sound, like the sky had been split down the middle and was being peeled back from both sides simultaneously. The temperature outside dropped through 0 and kept going. Nora sat with Emmett in the center of the room, away from the walls. Scout pressed between them, and she watched the small fire in the stone hearth, and she listened to the world above them, trying to cease to exist. The temperature inside the dugout held at 61 degrees. She had checked it twice with the small glass thermometer she had bought in Hettinger, one of the few non-essential items she had permitted herself. 61 degrees, while outside the mercury was plunging toward 30 below. She thought about Aldridge's house, the glass windows, the milled lumber walls, the Chicago-made stove that devoured cordwood like a furnace and still left the far corners cold at 40 below. She thought about Voss and his textbook cedar shakes. She thought about the Reverend's tar canvas roof. She did not think these things with satisfaction. She thought them with the same clear, cold attention she brought to everything. The attention of someone who cannot afford to be wrong, and therefore cannot afford to feel superior, because superiority is a distraction, and distractions get you killed. Emmett fell asleep against her shoulder. Scout did not sleep. He lay with his head on his paws and his ears forward, tracking the sound above them, and occasionally he lifted his chin and looked at Nora, and she looked back at him, and there was something in the exchange that was not comfort exactly, but was the closest thing to it available in a Dakota winter at 30 below. She did not sleep either. She sat in the warm room, and she thought about the tin box. She had been thinking about it more in the last few days, since Flood had shown her the survey notes with her grandfather's handwriting. The note had told her to find Willow Creek, to dig 6 feet. Flood's documents had confirmed the claim, the location, the deliberate choice of this particular spot. But there was something else Harriet had said, something Nora had not yet fully turned over in her mind. He dug into the ground. Same as you. Not claimed the land. Not surveyed. Dug. If Seamus had dug a pit here, even a preliminary one, even a test shaft to check the soil composition at depth, the way a mining man would, then something might remain of it. Not the structure. 18 years of Dakota winters would have collapsed any above-ground elements long since. But the floor, the deepest point, the hardest packed clay, compressed by years of settling. She looked at the hearthstone. The large flat stone she had placed at the base of the hearth, the biggest river stone she had been able to drag up from the creek bed, set at the center of the floor to anchor the thermal mass of the fire chamber. She had chosen it for its size and its flatness and its position in the creek bed, slightly above the water line, therefore drier, therefore better suited for the purpose. Or she had chosen it because it was already there, already placed, already positioned at the center of what had once been, might have been, something very much like what she was building now. She had not let herself examine this possibility too directly. The mind has a way of protecting itself from significance until it is ready to receive it. But sitting in the warm, dark room at 30 below while the world above tried to tear itself apart, she let herself look at the stone and think, what is underneath it? She let herself think. He said the earth always remembers. And then the first knock came. It was not loud. In the context of the sound the storm was making, it was barely audible. 4 quick strikes against the wooden door, irregular, desperate, the knock of someone whose hands are not working properly. Nora was at the door before she was fully aware of having stood up. She did not open it immediately. She braced herself, put her shoulder against the frame, and pushed it outward against the wind pressure. The door swung open, and the cold hit her like a wall. Prescott Aldridge's wife stood in the doorway. She was holding 2 children, one under each arm, both of them wrapped in quilts that were already stiff with ice. Behind her, Aldridge himself, and behind him, their oldest son, all of them roped together at the waist, all of them blue around the lips, all of them shaking with the particular violence of cold that has gone past the shivering stage and into something more dangerous. Nora grabbed the nearest child and pulled her inside. "Get in," she said. "All of you. Now." She did not say anything else. She did not wait for anyone to explain. She got them through the door, and she pulled it shut behind Aldridge, and the storm's sound dropped back to its muffled roar, and the warmth of the room hit them all like a physical thing, like being caught. Aldridge's wife sat down on the floor and began to cry. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing grief, but in the way of someone whose body has decided it is finally safe enough to let go of the tension that has been holding everything together for the last however many hours. Aldridge himself stood with his back against the wall. He was looking at the room, at the walls, at the ceiling, at the thermometer on the stone shelf, at the fire that was barely more than coals, and yet had kept this room at 61 degrees in a blizzard that had already destroyed his house. He could not look at Nora directly. The shame of it was too large and too immediate. She did not look at him either. She was already moving, wrapping the children in her wool blanket, pulling off their frozen outer layers, positioning them near the hearthstones. "Get their boots off," she said. "The damp will finish them faster than the cold." No one argued with her. She put water on to boil. The second knock came 40 minutes later. Captain Elbert Voss and his wife Meredith, having spent the previous 2 hours on their knees, stuffing rags into the cracks between the logs as fast as the frost split new ones open, having watched the cedar shakes on the north-facing roof section begin to lift and peel back one by one in the 70-mile-per-hour gusts, having ultimately made the calculation that a textbook could not save them, and that the girl in the dirt hole a quarter-mile away might be their only option. Voss did not speak when he came through the door. His wife was shaking too hard to speak. Nora made room, reorganized the sleeping arrangements, put Meredith Voss next to the hearthstones. Voss stood in the center of the room and looked at the thermometer. 62 degrees. He looked at it for a long time. He sat down on the floor beside his wife. The third knock came an hour after that. Reverend Ormond Hale was carrying his wife in his arms. Agnes Hale had been ill before the storm, a chest complaint that had been slow to resolve, and the hours in the collapsing clapboard house had not helped. She was unconscious when he brought her through the door, her breathing shallow and fast, her lips the color of old ash. The Reverend was weeping. He was not weeping with dignity. He was weeping the way a man weeps when he has been completely dismantled, when every structure he has built to protect himself from the understanding of his own fallibility has been stripped away by a wind that does not care about dignity or doctrine, or the difference between a man who has read a great deal and a 16-year-old girl who knows how cold behaves 6 feet underground. He set his wife down carefully on the section of floor Nora indicated. He looked at Nora. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Later. Right now, just help me get her warm." He nodded. He knelt beside his wife and took her hands in both of his and began rubbing them, back and forth, steady and deliberate, the way you do when the only thing you have left to give is the warmth of your own palms. Emmett, who had woken up when the first knock came and had been moving quietly around the room ever since, helping without being asked, passing blankets, filling cups, keeping Scout from getting underfoot, appeared beside Nora with the kettle. "Tea," he said, "for the Reverend's wife." Nora looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he was managing himself with a self-possession that made her chest ache. "Good," she said. He went. The fourth knock came as the clock turned toward midnight. Nora opened the door. Eric's strand fell through it. He did not fall dramatically. He stepped through, and his legs gave out on the threshold, and he went down to one knee. And Nora caught his arm before the rest of him followed. He was coated in ice from the chest down. His coat, his trousers, the wool scarf wound around his face. His hands, when she pulled off the outer gloves, were white and waxy in the way that meant serious cold damage, the kind that takes months to heal if it heals at all. But pressed against his chest, inside the coat, held in place by a belt he had tightened around his torso specifically to keep it there, was an oilskin tube the length of his forearm. He gripped her wrist with one frozen hand. "Don't let Aldridge have it," he said. His voice was wrecked from the cold. "It's the original. The county copy. I got it before he could have it destroyed." She looked at him. "I told you to trust me," he said. She helped him to the floor. She pulled off his outer layers. She wrapped her own coat around him, the good wool one with the money still sewn in the lining even now, because she had never found a better place for it. Emmett appeared with the kettle again. "He needs this more than the Reverend's wife," Nora said. "I already gave her some," Emmett said. "I made more." She looked at her brother, 9 years old. "Emmett," she said. "I know," he said, and went to refill the kettle. The room held 16 people by midnight. The temperature held at 63 degrees. Outside, the blizzard was doing what the blizzard of 1873 had done, remaking the world, erasing the distinction between sky and ground, covering everything in the flat white absolute of a Dakota winter in full force. The temperature outside had dropped to 42 below zero. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. At that temperature, the moisture in your breath turns to ice crystals before it has cleared your lips. Aldridge's 2-story house had lost both front windows and the east-facing wall of the upper story. Voss's log cabin was holding, but the interior temperature had dropped to 18 degrees before they left, and it was lower now. The Reverend's clapboard house had lost most of its roof. Inside the dugout, the stone hearth held its warmth. The sod ceiling absorbed the wind load without complaint. The clay walls, packed by Nora's bare hands, sealed with clay mortar and dried prairie grass, 6 feet of compressed Dakota earth between the interior air and the surface temperature, did exactly what her grandfather had told her they would do. They remembered summer. They held it quietly, steadily, without drama, the way the earth holds everything it has ever been given, patient and deep and not particularly interested in whether anyone believed it could. Nora sat with her back against the warm wall and looked at the room full of people. Aldridge's youngest daughter had fallen asleep against Scout's side. The girl had not spoken since she arrived, had not cried, had simply gone quiet in the way of children who have been frightened past the point where crying helps. But she had one hand buried in Scout's gray fur, and Scout had his chin resting on her ankle, and the girl's breathing was slow and even. Voss was looking at the thermometer again. He had been looking at it on and off for the last 2 hours. Every time he looked, it said the same thing. Agnes Hale was breathing more easily, The steady warmth was doing what no medicine available in Millhaven could have done, simply keeping her at a temperature where her body could do its own work. Her color was coming back. Hale himself had stopped weeping. He was sitting with his back straight and his hands folded, and he had the look of a man who is doing very hard thinking and is not yet ready to share the results. Eric was warming up slowly. His hands were going to hurt badly when the feeling fully came back. Nora had seen frostbite before, knew the stages, but the waxy color was fading, and that was the important thing. He was sitting against the north wall with the oilskin tube in his lap, and he caught Nora's eye across the room and held it for a moment. She looked away first. She looked at the hearthstone, the large flat river stone at the base of the fire chamber. The one she had dragged up from the creek bed had set at the center of the floor. The one she had chosen, or had been led to, or had both. The distinction collapsing now into something that felt less like coincidence and more like the fulfillment of a very long, very patient intention. The fire had burned down to almost nothing. There was enough warmth stored in the stones and the walls to hold the room through the night. She did not need to add fuel. She could move the hearthstone. She looked around the room. Aldridge and his wife were asleep. Voss was still staring at the thermometer. Hale was still thinking. Emmett had fallen asleep finally, curled beside Scout and Aldridge's daughter, the three of them a small, warm arrangement of trust. She got up quietly. She went to the hearth and waited for the last of the coals to cool to gray. Then she crouched down and put both hands on the large, flat stone and shifted it to the side. Beneath it, the floor clay was darker, older, compressed differently from the rest. She dug into it with her knife, 6 inches, 8 inches, and then the blade hit something solid that was not stone. She worked around the edge with the blade. She pulled. It came up out of the clay with the reluctance of something that has been waiting a very long time and is not sure the moment has arrived. A tin box, rectangular, sealed with a strip of leather that had dried to the consistency of wood. The metal was pitted with rust, but solid, intact, the seams still true. On the lid, scratched with something sharp, S.C., 1868. Seamus Callahan, her grandfather. The year Nora was not yet born. She held the box in both hands, and the room was warm, and the storm above her was trying to tear the world apart, and did not succeed. And the fire was out, but the walls remembered summer. The walls remembered everything they had ever been given, and she held the box, and she breathed. She did not open it yet. She was not ready yet, but she held it, and that was enough for now. And outside the blizzard of 1886 did what blizzards do. It spent itself against the indifferent earth, and the earth held, as it always holds, as it always has, patient and deep and full of things that are waiting to be found by the right person at the right moment. The earth always remembers. The storm did not stop that night. It did not stop the next morning either. It ran for 48 hours without pause, without mercy, without any of the brief lulls that sometimes break a Dakota blizzard into manageable pieces. It simply continued. The same absolute sound, the same white erasure of everything above the surface. The same temperature that sat at 38, 40, 42 below zero and did not rise. The world outside the dugout ceased to exist in any practical sense. There was no town. There was no creek. There was no flat horizon or bare cottonwood or frozen road. There was only the sound and the white and the cold that would kill a person in minutes if they stepped into it unprotected. Inside, there were 16 people and one old dog and one tin box that Nora had set on the shelf beside the thermometer and had not yet opened. She would open it when the time was right. She did not know exactly when that would be, but she knew it was not yet. The first hours were the hardest to organize. 16 people in a space built for one was not a comfort problem. It was a logistics problem, and Nora treated it as such, methodically, without sentiment, the way her grandfather's note had taught her to treat everything the earth presented. She assessed what she had. She divided it. The floor space went to the children and the sick first. Agnes Hale lay along the south wall, the warmest section, closest to the hearthstones, with 2 blankets over her and Reverend Hale sitting upright beside her, holding her hand with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that holding on is the only thing left in his power. Aldridge's 2 youngest children were near the center, where the air temperature was most consistent. Emmett had given up his bedroll without being asked and was sitting against the east wall with his back straight and his piece of slate in his lap, working through figures in the dim light of the single kerosene lantern. Nora rationed the lantern fuel the same way she rationed the food, by need, by duration, by the cold arithmetic of what they had against how long they might need it to last. She did not tell anyone how little food there was. There was enough. Probably enough. The dried beans and the salt pork and the flour Harriet had brought, plus what the Aldridges had thought to grab on their way out. A sack of cornmeal, a wrapped wedge of hard cheese, would stretch to 3 days if they were careful, and to 2 if they were not. Nora calculated this in her head while she was distributing the first meal, small portions in the tin plates, and she kept her face neutral and her movements unhurried, because panic in a confined space is its own kind of storm, and she had no room for it. Prescott Aldridge watched her work. He said nothing for a long time. He sat against the north wall with his knees drawn up and his hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water. She had no tea left, but hot water was something. And he watched Nora move through the room with the expression of a man who is in the process of revising a very large and very fundamental assumption about the world. His wife had fallen into an exhausted sleep. His children were warm. His oldest son was sitting beside Emmett, and the 2 boys were doing something with the slate that involved a great deal of quiet concentration, and it struck Aldridge, watching them, that his son looked more comfortable in this earthen room than he had looked in weeks inside the big house with its glass windows and its Chicago stove, and its $800 of milled lumber that was currently missing an east wall. He looked at the thermometer, 63 degrees. He looked at the tin chimney, at the sod ceiling, at the clay walls that Nora had packed with her bare hands and sealed with grass mortar, and that were, at this moment, holding 63 degrees against 42 below zero without complaint. He had spent $1,200 building a house that was currently in pieces. She had spent $29 building a room that was saving his children's lives. He did not say anything. Not yet. The shame was still too fresh and too large and too close to the surface. And a man like Prescott Aldridge did not have a great deal of practice with shame, which made it harder, not easier, to manage. He looked at his cup of hot water. He looked at the floor. It was Emmett who broke the silence, though not intentionally. He was teaching Aldridge's son, whose name was Philip, 14 years old, who had his father's broad shoulders and, it was becoming apparent, considerably more of his mother's temperament. The long division problem he had been working through on the slate. They had been at it quietly for 20 minutes, and Philip was following along with the careful attention of someone encountering an idea that has been presented more clearly than he has encountered it before. "Your sister teach you that?" Philip asked. "Everything," Emmett said simply. "She taught me everything." Philip glanced across the room at Nora, who was checking Agnes Hale's pulse with 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, counting quietly, her lips moving slightly. "She's not like I thought she was," he said. "What did you think she was?" Philip considered this. "I don't know. Stupid, I guess. Because of the hole." Emmett looked at him with the patient, slightly tired expression of someone who has heard this many times. "The hole is why we're all alive right now," he said, without heat, as a simple statement of observable fact. Philip was quiet for a while. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Agnes Hale regained consciousness around the 4th hour. It happened slowly, not the sudden surfacing of someone waking from sleep, but the gradual return of someone who has been a long way away and is finding the route back. Her eyes opened and found the ceiling and tracked across it without comprehension for a moment, and then found Hale's face bent over hers, and some of the tension in her own face released. She said his name. He pressed her hand hard against his chest and closed his eyes. The room was quiet enough that everyone heard this, and no one spoke for a moment because some things do not require commentary and benefit from the respect of silence. Agnes looked around the room with the careful inventory of someone assessing a new situation. She looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the thermometer on the shelf, at Nora, who had moved back to the center of the room and was watching her steadily. "Are we in the ground?" Agnes asked. 6 feet down, Nora said. Agnes considered this. "It's warm." "Yes." Agnes closed her eyes again. A small sound came from her, not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. Something in between, the sound of a body that has come back from a very cold place and is taking stock of the warmth. "Ormond," she said, without opening her eyes. "Yes," said the Reverend. "You were wrong about the girl." A pause. "Yes," said the Reverend. "I was." It was deep in the second night when Aldridge's youngest daughter found Scout. The girl's name was Cora. She was 6 years old, and she had not spoken since she arrived. Not from injury. Nothing physical had happened to her. But fear at a sufficient intensity has its own kind of weight, and the weight of it had settled on Cora somewhere between leaving the house and arriving at the dugout, and it had not lifted. She sat where she was placed. She ate what she was given. She did not cry, which was almost harder to watch than crying would have been. Scout found her first, technically. He made his way across the crowded floor with the slow, deliberate navigation of an old dog who is accustomed to working around obstacles, and he lay down beside Cora without invitation and put his chin on her ankle and did not move. For a while, nothing happened. Then Cora's hand came down, slowly, and rested on top of Scout's head. Scout did not react. He simply remained, warm and still, as though being a point of contact for a frightened child was the exact purpose he had been saving his energy for. Nora watched from across the room. After a while, Cora leaned down, very slowly, and put her lips close to Scout's ear. "Are you lost too?" she whispered. The words were barely audible. Nora almost didn't catch them, but she caught them, and so did Emmett, who was sitting 2 feet away, and so did Harriet Webb, who had arrived at some point during the first night, having weathered the storm in her own small shelter with the equanimity of someone who has survived worse. And so, from across the room, did Prescott Aldridge. Scout's tail moved once against the floor. Just once. Cora straightened up. She looked at Emmett. "Does he have a name?" she said. A full sentence, clear and direct. "Scout," Emmett said, with the careful steadiness of someone who understands they are in the middle of a delicate thing and does not want to disturb it. Cora nodded. She put her hand back on Scout's head. "He found us," she said, "like he was looking for us." Emmett looked at Nora. Nora looked at Cora. She thought of Scout sitting at the rim of the half-finished pit on the 9th day, thin-ribbed and patient, waiting to be let in. She thought of Emmett saying he found us so we wouldn't be alone, and herself saying 1 week, if he slows us down. She thought about how wrong she had been about what slowing down meant, what usefulness meant, what a worn-out old dog with a torn ear could be worth when the temperature dropped to 40 below, and a frightened 6-year-old needed something warm and solid and completely without judgment to put her hands on. She looked at Aldridge. He had his face turned away, but she could see the set of his shoulders. And the set of his shoulders was the set of a man who is in the middle of something private and difficult and would very much like no one to notice. She looked back at the tin box on the shelf. Eric was asleep against the north wall, his hands wrapped in strips of cloth that Nora had cut from the hem of her spare shirt, the warmest bandaging available in a room that contained no medical supplies. The color had come back to his fingers by the 3rd hour, which meant the damage was superficial, which meant painful but recoverable, which was the best news Nora had received in several days. The oilskin tube was still in his lap, held loosely in his bandaged hands, as though even in sleep some part of him was keeping track of it. Emmett was asleep too, finally, after the long, useful hours of quiet helpfulness that had made Nora's chest hurt in the particular way it hurt when you look at someone you love being more than you expected them to be. The room was quiet. The storm was still audible above, but it had acquired a different quality in the last few hours. Still enormous, still absolute, but with less of the tearing, splitting aggression of the first night and more of a sustained, exhausted pressure, like something that has been fighting for a long time and is beginning to run out of force. Nora took the tin box down from the shelf. She carried it to the hearthstone and sat down and set it in her lap. The metal was cold. The leather seal was dry and stiff as old bark. She worked at it with her knife, carefully, not wanting to force anything. And after a few minutes, it gave, the dried leather crumbling at the edges where the decades had made it brittle. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry for 18 years, a single folded letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges but intact, the ink faded to brown but legible. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something you know will not survive many more foldings. The handwriting was her grandfather's, the same hand as the note, the same deliberate, slightly irregular script of a man who had learned to write as an adult, late in life, in a language not his own. She read it twice before she let herself understand it fully. It began, "To whoever finds this place." It went on for 3/4 of a page, describing the soil composition at depth, the drainage angle, the way to position the hearthstone for maximum thermal retention. It described the sod cutting technique, the chimney construction, the specific type of stone to use for the hearth. It was a technical document, precise and detailed, written by a man who understood what he was recording and wanted it preserved correctly. And then, in the last paragraph, the handwriting changed slightly. Not a different hand, but the same hand moving faster, as if he had run out of time or patience or both. I came here in 1868 with nothing. I found this ground and I understood it. I dug here to prove it could be done, and it can be done. The earth at 6 feet does not forget summer. It does not forget anything. If you carry my name, then you already know this is true because I am the reason you know it. I built this place to show you it was possible. The doing of it was always going to be yours. The ground was waiting. It will keep you. It kept me. The earth always remembers. And below that, in smaller letters, clearly added later, in a slightly different ink, for the one who comes after me. Nora sat with the letter for a long time. The room breathed around her. The slow, deep breath of sleeping people, of children who had been frightened and were now warm enough to let their bodies rest. Scout snored lightly from his position beside Cora. The fire was out, but the walls were warm, and the warmth was steady and total, the way her grandfather had said it would be. A sound from beside her. Eric was awake. He was watching her with the quiet attention he brought to most things, not intruding, not asking, simply present and available if she wanted company, and prepared to remain silent if she didn't. She held out the letter. He took it. He read it. He read it again. He folded it carefully along the original creases and held it out to her, and she took it back and held it against her chest. He never knew you, Eric said. Not a question. He died when I was 5. He knew you would come. He paused. Or someone like you would come. Someone who needed it. He knew my mother might need it, she said. She never did. She went to Chicago instead. And then I needed it. She looked at the hearthstone, at the hollow in the clay where the tin box had been waiting. 18 years, she said. Some things are patient, Eric said. They sat in silence for a while. The storm above them was losing its grip on the world, degree by degree, mile by mile, as all storms eventually do. Not gone yet, not finished. But the sound had changed, and Nora, who had been listening to it for 48 hours, could hear the change. The county records, she said. You went to get the originals. Aldridge had someone going to Hettinger the day after you came back from Flood's office, he said. I heard it at the livery. He was going to have the duplicate filed as the primary and have Flood's copy declared unofficial. It would have tied you up in courts for 2 years. So you went first. I left that night, rode through the early storm to get ahead of his man. He looked at his bandaged hands. Got the originals. Got caught in the leading edge coming back. He paused. It was colder than I expected. Nora looked at his hands, at the careful wrapping she had done 3 hours ago. You should have told me, she said. You would have told me not to go. She opened her mouth, closed it. Yes, she said. I would have. That's why I didn't tell you. Scout made a sound in his sleep, a low, contented sound, the sound of a dog dreaming of warmth. Cora's hand was still resting on his side, even in sleep, small and relaxed against the gray fur. Nora set the letter back inside the tin box and set it on the shelf. She looked at Eric. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He did not make more of it than that, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. his ability to receive a thing at its stated value and not try to inflate it or diminish it. He had the quality her grandfather's note had described in a different way. He understood what things were actually worth. She put her hand over his bandaged hands. He did not move. He simply turned his hands slightly, carefully, so that her fingers were resting in his palm. They sat like that until the storm finally, quietly, exhausted and spent, began to die. It was close to dawn when the sound above them shifted for the last time, from sustained to intermittent, from wall to gust, from absolute to merely severe. The temperature outside would still be dangerous for hours. The drifts would be waist-high in places, chest-high against anything that had broken the wind. But the worst of it was over, and everyone in the room could feel it. Even those who were sleeping, something in the body registering the change in pressure, the way animals register the passing of a storm before it is visible. Scout raised his head. He had not moved from beside Cora for 6 hours. He had not eaten since the previous morning. He had done what he came to do, which was be present and warm and completely without judgment in the middle of the worst night anyone in the room had ever had. And he had done it with the total commitment of an animal that has found its purpose and intends to see it through. He raised his head and looked at Nora. She looked back at him. His tail moved, slow, once. Then he laid his head back down on the floor, and he breathed out, long and slow and very quiet, and he did not breathe in again. Emmett woke at the change in weight against his side. He looked at Scout. He put his hand on the gray fur very gently and held it there. The room was completely still. "He found us so we wouldn't be alone," Emmett said. His voice was steady. He was 9 years old, and his voice was steady. "He can rest now." No one spoke. Cora's hand, still resting on Scout's side, did not move for a long moment. Then she lifted it, carefully, as if completing something. She looked at Emmett with the clear, direct look of a child who has just encountered something real and is deciding what to do with it. "He wasn't lost anymore," she said. At the end. "No," Emmett said. "He wasn't." Outside, the storm was dying. Inside, the earth held its warmth, steady and patient and complete, the way it always had, the way it always would. And 16 people breathed in the room that Nora Callahan had built with a sharpened branch and her bare hands and $29 and her grandfather's 4 lines of handwriting. And the cold outside could not reach them. And the ground remembered, and Scout lay still and warm in the last of the firelight, while the long Dakota night finally, slowly, let go. The morning after the storm was the quietest morning Nora had ever known. Not peaceful quiet. Not the quiet of a Sunday before church, or the quiet of a house where everyone is still sleeping. It was the quiet of aftermath, the specific silence that follows something enormous when the world is assessing its own damage and has not yet decided how to speak about it. She opened the door at first light and the cold hit her, still sharp, still serious, but without the killing intent of the previous 2 days. The sky had gone pale blue, washed clean. The kind of sky that appears after a storm as though it has nothing to do with what just happened. The snow was everywhere. It had rearranged the landscape entirely. The drifts were chest-high against the cottonwoods along the creek, waist-high across the open ground, and the trail into Millhaven had ceased to exist as a distinct feature of the earth. There was only white in every direction, broken by the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional dark mass of a structure that had held. Not all of them had held. She could see the roofline of Aldridge's house from the ridge above the dugout. The east wall of the upper story was gone, the interior exposed to the sky, the contents of the upstairs rooms already buried under 2 feet of snow that had poured in through the gap. Voss's log cabin was standing, but the north-facing roof section had partially collapsed. The cedar shakes she had watched him install with such careful attention to his textbook now scattered across the drifts like playing cards. The Reverend's clapboard house was missing most of its canvas roof covering, the interior open to the elements, the potbelly stove standing in the middle of what had been the parlor like a small iron monument to insufficient preparation. Nora stood on the ridge and looked at all of it for a long time. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had thought, in the abstract, during the weeks when people were calling her a fool and a mole and a girl playing in the dirt, that if she was ever proved right, the proving of it would feel like something large and satisfying, like a door opening, like a weight lifted. It did not feel like that. It felt like loss. Emmett came and stood beside her. He looked at the damaged houses. He looked at the white landscape. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Pruitt." Nora closed her eyes. Jedediah Pruitt had lived alone at the eastern edge of the settlement, 3/4 of a mile from the center of town. In a single-room house he had built himself 20 years ago. He was 73 years old. He had been in Millhaven longer than anyone except Harriet Webb and had, in the way of men who have survived a long time alone, developed an absolute confidence in his own judgment that had served him reasonably well until the moment it didn't. Nora had gone to his door the afternoon before the storm. She had knocked twice. He had opened the door and listened to her with the polite disinterest of someone waiting for a stranger to finish speaking so he could go back to what he was doing. "Lived through 17 winters," he had said. 17. This house has stood through all of them. She had not been able to make him understand. They found him an hour later when Emmett waded through the drifts to check. He was at his table. He had been eating supper when the cold came in through the failed roof seam, and at some point during the night, the temperature in the room had dropped low enough that he had simply gone to sleep in the cold and had not woken up. There was no violence in it, no visible suffering. He looked like a man who had been interrupted. Nora stood in the doorway of Pruitt's house and looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back outside and closed the door carefully behind her, and she stood in the snow and the cold blue morning, and she cried, not for long, not dramatically, but fully, the way you cry when you are not crying for yourself, but for something that did not have to happen, and did, for the specific weight of a life that ended because the gap between what a person believed and what was true turned out to be wider than the distance from his house to the warmth that could have saved him. Emmett stood beside her without speaking, which was exactly right. When she was finished, she wiped her face. 3 people, she said. 2 other homesteaders on the far edge of the territory had not made it either. A family who had been too far out to reach anyone, whose story they would not learn until the spring thaw. 3 people who didn't have to die. Emmett looked at her. You tried to warn them. I know, she said. That doesn't make it better. No, he said, but it means it wasn't yours to carry. She looked at him, 9 years old. She put her hand on the back of his neck briefly, the way their mother used to, and he leaned into it for a moment the way he always had, and then they walked back toward Millhaven. The reckoning came in pieces over the following days, the way things come apart or come together after a storm. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small gestures and silences and words that people had been holding back until they had enough warmth in them to let the words out. Captain Albert Voss burned his survival manual on the third day after the storm. He did it deliberately in front of his wife and Nora and Harriet Webb, who happened to be passing on her way back from checking on Agnes Hale. He carried the book outside and set it on the cleared patch of ground he had scraped free of snow, and held a match to the corner of the cover and stood back and watched it burn. It took longer than he expected, being a thick book, and the watching of it was clearly doing something in him that went deeper than the burning. When it was ash, he turned to Nora. "I would like to learn," he said, "how you did it. All of it, properly, from the beginning." "All right," she said. He nodded once, and that was the beginning of it. Reverend Ormond Hale delivered his sermon the following Sunday to a congregation that was smaller than it had been before the storm, several families having already made the decision to move on rather than rebuild, but denser in attention than any he had preached to before. He stood at his pulpit. They had repaired the roof of the clapboard building enough to use it, Voss and Aldridge working together on it, which was its own kind of revelation. And he looked out at the faces before him, and he said what he had been preparing to say since the night he had knelt on Nora Callahan's earthen floor and rubbed warmth back into his wife's hands. "I told a young woman that God builds upward," he said. That reaching toward heaven was the direction of righteousness. I told her this from a position of comfort and certainty, and I was wrong. The congregation was very still. "The Lord builds in every direction," he said. "He builds upward and downward and deep into the earth. And deliverance comes from unexpected places. It comes from the people we dismiss. It comes from the knowledge we refuse to receive, because the vessel carrying it does not look the way we expect wisdom to look." He paused. "I owe a specific debt of honesty to Miss Nora Callahan, who preserved the lives of my wife and children at no benefit to herself, and with no obligation to do so, given how she had been treated." His voice did not waver, though Nora, sitting in the third row, could see the effort it cost him. "I was wrong about her. I ask her forgiveness, and I ask this congregation to witness the asking." The silence after that was the kind of silence that means something has shifted and cannot be shifted back. Nora looked at her hands in her lap. She did not say anything during the service. She said what she needed to say afterward, on the steps outside, briefly and without theater. "I forgive you, Reverend, and your wife is welcome at the dugout whenever she wants to come." Agnes Hale, standing beside her husband, reached out and took Nora's hand. She held it for a moment and then let go, and her expression said everything that words would have been insufficient to carry. Prescott Aldridge came to the dugout 4 days after the storm. He came alone, without his son, without the bearing of a man who was accustomed to arriving at places and being received as important. He came on foot, which was unusual for him, and he knocked at the door with the measured knock of someone who has rehearsed the knocking several times before actually doing it. Nora opened the door. He held out an envelope. She took it. Inside was the deed to the disputed creek land, signed over to Nora Callahan, with the homestead claim number that matched Seamus's original filing from 1868. Below the deed were the documents related to Emmett's guardianship, the complaint he had filed through Deputy Crane, formally withdrawn, along with a separate letter from the county clerk acknowledging Nora Callahan as legal guardian of Emmett Callahan by virtue of the homestead claim and her demonstrated capacity for care. She looked at the documents for a moment. She looked at Aldridge. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not make a speech. He simply stood in the doorway of the room that had saved his children's lives and looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has finally arrived at an accurate understanding of something he has been wrong about for a long time, and he said, "It doesn't settle the debt. It won't ever settle it. But it's what I can do." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He turned and walked back toward town, and she watched him go until the distance and the snow made him indistinct, and then she went inside and set the documents in the tin box beside her grandfather's letter and placed the tin box back on the shelf. Not under the hearthstone this time. On the shelf, where it could be seen. Deputy Silas Crane never came. 3 weeks after the storm, a letter arrived from the county office, addressed to Nora Callahan, in the handwriting of a county clerk, informing her that the complaint regarding the structural safety of her dwelling and the guardianship of Emmett Callahan had been formally withdrawn, and the matter closed. The letter was 2 sentences long, and contained no apology and no explanation. Nora read it once, folded it, and put it in the tin box. Some things end without ceremony. She had learned enough about the world to know that this was not failure. It was simply the truth that not every person arrives at the moment where they must look you in the eye and account for what they did. Crane had done what he had done, and had chosen not to face it, and that choice would follow him in the way that such choices follow people, quietly and without fanfare, and it was not hers to pursue. She put the tin box on the shelf and went back to work. Eric Strand's hands healed slowly, the way frostbite heals, the feeling returning in stages over several weeks, accompanied by the particular pain of circulation restoring itself to damaged tissue. He worked through it. He was not the kind of man who mentioned pain unless it was preventing him from doing something, and it did not prevent him from doing very much. Though Nora noticed the careful way he held certain tools in the first weeks and said nothing about it. He came to the dugout most evenings. Emmett had stopped pretending not to notice. One evening in late November, when the temperature had dropped again to 15 below, and the 3 of them were sitting inside after supper. Emmett working through his lessons by lamplight, Eric repairing a cabinet hinge, Nora reading her mother's copy of one of the 3 books she had carried in the canvas sack. Eric set down the hinge and reached into his coat pocket and set something on the floor between himself and Nora. It was the folded paper. The note, her grandfather's note, the original, pressed flat and carefully sealed between 2 thin pieces of pine with a strip of leather binding, a small simple frame that preserved it without covering the words. "I thought it should be protected," he said, "before it wore through entirely." She looked at the framed note. She looked at him. "He kept you safe for 16 years, Eric said, without knowing who you were, without knowing if you would ever come." He paused. "I know who you are. I've been watching you build something out of nothing for 2 months. I would like, if you'll allow it, to keep doing that." Another pause. The careful pause of a man who chooses his words with the same precision he chooses his materials. "Watching and helping, if you'll allow it." Emmett set down his slate. Nora looked at her brother. He looked back at her with the expression of a 9-year-old who has known something for several weeks and has been waiting with heroic patience for the adults to catch up. "Grandpa Seamus would have liked him," Emmett said. "He's practical." Nora looked at Eric. He was watching her with the same quiet attention he always brought to things, not pushing, not asking her to be anything other than what she was, simply present and patient and true. She picked up the framed note. "Yes," she said. "I'll allow it." They were married in the spring, in the dugout, with Harriet Webb and the Hales and the Vosses present, and Emmett standing beside Nora with his piece of slate tucked under his arm for reasons he did not entirely explain. The ceremony was simple. The room was warm. Outside, the first prairie grass of 1887 was coming in green along Willow Creek. They buried Scout beside the cottonwood nearest the door. Emmett carved the marker himself with a borrowed chisel and more patience than anyone his age should reasonably possess. The words took him 3 days to get right. When he was finished, the stone read, "Scout. He found us first. He stayed the longest. He left us warmer than he found us." The community formally changed the name of the settlement at a town meeting in March 1887, the first town meeting Nora had been invited to attend. The vote was not close. The new name was entered into the county records on March 14th, 1887, Callahan's Stand. Not because they were required to change it, not because anyone told them to, but because the name Millhaven no longer described what the place was, and Callahan's Stand did. 20 years passed. Emmett Callahan was admitted to the North Dakota bar in 1905. He was 28 years old, and he opened his practice in Bismarck, and above his desk he hung the original survey map of the Callahan homestead, the one with Seamus's handwriting in the margins. He specialized in land disputes and guardianship cases. His clients were, almost without exception, women and children. He was not famous for this work in the way that famous men are famous. He was known the way useful things are known, practically by the people who needed him, passed from hand to hand the way her grandfather had passed knowledge through the generations, without fanfare, without a great deal of ceremony, because the work itself was the point. His daughter, born in 1910, became a lawyer too. Her first case was a guardianship dispute in Morton County. She won. Nora and Eric's daughter, Iris, was born in 1889, not in the dugout, in the frame house they had built alongside it by then, though the dugout remained, repurposed as the finest root cellar in the territory. Iris grew up to be a naturalist and a writer. Her book on earthen construction, published in 1912 by a university press in Minneapolis, dedicated 6 chapters to the thermal principles her mother had applied at Callahan's Stand and included technical drawings of the original dugout that were used as teaching material in 3 state universities. On the dedication page, she wrote, "For my grandfather, who chose the ground. For my mother, who dug it." Cora Aldridge grew up and became a school teacher. She taught in Callahan's Stand for 30 years. She kept a dog her entire adult life, always a gray one, always named Scout. She never explained why to anyone who hadn't already understood. The year Nora turned 50, her granddaughter came to visit. A girl of 7, Emmett's youngest, named Margaret, who had her great-great-grandfather Seamus's coloring and his habit of looking at things carefully before touching them. Margaret found the dugout in the afternoon, poking around the property the way children do, and she went inside and stood in the center of the floor and turned around slowly, looking at the clay walls and the sod ceiling and the stone hearth that had not held a fire in 30 years. She came out and found Nora on the porch. "Were you really in there?" she said. "All winter?" "2 winters," Nora said, "before the frame house was finished." "Wasn't it scary?" Nora looked at the girl. She looked at the dugout, at the crooked door and the sod roof and the thin line of the old tin chimney, patched twice now and still standing. "Every single day," she said. "I was frightened every single day. The cold was real. The danger was real. There were nights I did not know if we would be all right." Margaret considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old confronting something larger than she expected. "But you stayed," she said. "The ground held me up," Nora said, "when nothing else would." Margaret looked at the dugout. "Can you teach me?" she said. "What great-great-grandpa Seamus taught you?" Nora looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in the Dakota Territory in autumn, going gold and long across the flat grass, catching the creek, making everything it touched look briefly like something that would last. "Yes, my darling," she said. "I will teach you everything." In the winter of 1951, a research team from the University of North Dakota arrived at what had by then become a small county museum at the site of the original Callahan homestead. The dugout had been preserved by the County Historical Society in 1934, the year after Nora Callahan Strand passed away peacefully in the frame house she and Eric had built beside it. The curator let the researchers in, and they set up their instruments and spent an afternoon taking measurements. The interior temperature of the dugout, with no heat source and no fire for more than 40 years, was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. They checked the instruments twice. They published their findings in a materials journal the following spring. The paper noted that the thermal stability was consistent with the principles of earth-sheltered construction, that the specific combination of depth, soil composition, and thermal mass created a passive heating system of remarkable efficiency, and that the construction showed sophisticated understanding of geological principles. The paper did not mention that the system had been designed by a 16-year-old girl with a sharpened branch and $29 in 4 lines of her grandfather's handwriting. The county museum added a small sign beside the door of the dugout. It read, "Callahan's Stand, established 1886. Still standing," and it was. It still is. The earth always remembers. And so do the people it shelters. If you are facing your own storm right now, if the cold feels like it has come from every direction at once, and the people who were supposed to help have closed their doors, remember Nora Callahan. Remember that she was 16 years old, and she had $29 and a worn piece of paper, and she dug 6 feet down into the frozen Dakota ground with a sharpened branch and her bare hands, and the earth held her, and the earth remembered, and she survived. You are stronger than you know. The ground beneath you has been waiting